Police, open the door!
Who's there?
It was 7 a.m. when the illusion of suburban peace shattered. A patrol car tore into the driveway with tires screaming against concrete, red and blue lights flashing in a neighborhood that prided itself on silence and symmetry.
This is the reality! Look at these numbers! We are out of time! I understand this!
The sound cut through the calm morning air like a blade. Officer Brent Blackwood stepped out of the vehicle with the rigid posture.
What is this? This is a mistake!
Officer Smith, you are under arrest. You have no right!
Of someone performing authority rather than embodying it. His hand rested on his holster, not because danger was present, but because intimidation was the objective. Standing behind him, wrapped in silk confidence and neighborhood supremacy, was his wife, Constance Blackwood, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Her arms were crossed, her smile sharp and satisfied, as though the scene unfolding before her was long-anticipated entertainment. The accusation was trespassing. The crime was using a pool that the Dalton family paid $300 a month to access. The performance was deliberate. Miles Dalton stood in his doorway in a bathrobe, coffee still warm in his hand, outwardly calm but internally analyzing every movement. He had spent 15 years infiltrating drug cartels and dismantling organized crime networks for the FBI. He had survived undercover operations that would break most men. He had watched criminal empires collapse under the weight of evidence. He had retired to Willowbrook Estates for peace. He had not expected war. 3 weeks earlier, he and his wife Elena had purchased a modest ranch home in what looked like a postcard version of American suburbia. Brick mailboxes stood identical in disciplined rows. Lawns were trimmed to regulation perfection. The air smelled of cut grass and weekend barbecues. It was the kind of neighborhood where the greatest fear was a parking ticket. It was supposed to be safe. The first sign that it was not came on day 3. Constance Blackwood arrived in a white luxury SUV bearing a vanity plate that declared ownership of the community more than residency. She delivered a violation notice with ceremonial authority. Miles's work truck, used for private security consulting, was declared a prohibited commercial vehicle. A $200 daily fine was threatened until compliance. The irony was impossible to ignore. A police cruiser was permanently parked in her driveway, treated as a symbol of protection rather than policy violation. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Some vehicles belonged. Some families did not. That weekend, Sophie and Jake Dalton discovered the community pool. To them, it was freedom. To their parents, it was a symbol of normalcy long overdue. After years of danger and unpredictability, this was supposed to be the reward. But Constance appeared at the pool like a storm cloud on a clear afternoon. Access was suddenly under review. Background verification was required. Cards were to be surrendered pending approval. There was no written notice. No official procedure. Only authority disguised as policy. The children's excitement dissolved into confusion. That was the moment Miles understood something fundamental. This was not about rules. This was about power. Monday morning confirmed it. Officer Brent Blackwood arrived in uniform to enforce an HOA dispute as though responding to violent crime. He demanded surrender of pool access cards. He implied arrest. He leaned into intimidation. Miles recognized the signs instantly. He had studied corrupt officers for years. He had built cases around men who wore badges like weapons. Brent's aggression was not confidence. It was insecurity masked as dominance. Documentation was requested. Brent faltered. Property deeds and HOA covenants were presented. The law was cited calmly. And for the first time, the balance shifted. The officer retreated with a warning disguised as advice. Trouble, he implied, would be met with consequences. Miles watched him leave and recognized something else. This was not random. This was systemic. And if it was systemic, it had weaknesses. By evening, the retired federal agent had begun mapping the power structure of Willowbrook Estates. Patterns emerged quickly. Families who questioned expenses received police visits. Residents who requested transparency faced code enforcement complaints. Selective enforcement disguised itself as community standards. The Blackwoods had created a closed system. Constance identified undesirables. Brent applied badge-powered pressure. Compliance was achieved through fear. Most people fled quietly. Miles Dalton did not flee. He observed. He documented. He waited. Because the greatest mistake any corrupt system can make is targeting someone who knows how systems collapse. And Willowbrook Estates was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The neighborhood appeared peaceful under the morning sun. but beneath its carefully manicured surface, tension moved quietly like something alive beneath still water. Miles Dalton spent the following days studying Willowbrook Estates the way he had studied criminal organizations during his federal career. The difference was scale, not complexity. Cartel networks operated across cities, HOA corruption operated across streets. Both thrived on fear, selective loyalty, and information control. The community center was the heart of neighborhood administration, though it looked more like a bureaucratic theater than a civic space. Fluorescent lights hummed constantly, casting pale institutional shadows across metal folding chairs that had witnessed countless meetings where residents learned to stay silent. The meeting attendance pattern was the first suspicious detail Miles recorded. The usual crowd of 30 residents had quietly shrunk to around 12 over the past year. Several attendees wore small safety buttons printed with Constance Blackwood's name. The message was subtle but psychologically effective. Public alignment with authority reduced personal risk. Dorothy Brighton, a retired school teacher in her 60s, became the first meaningful intelligence source. Miles met her while admiring her garden roses one afternoon. She spoke politely, with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned that curiosity could be punished. Her eyes often drifted toward the Blackwood residence as though monitoring invisible surveillance cameras. They talked about neighborhood life. They talked about children growing up in safe environments. Then Miles asked about HOA enforcement. The woman's expression changed immediately. The Henderson family had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 2 years before leaving abruptly. Officially, they relocated for employment reasons. Unofficially, the pressure had become unbearable. Patio furniture complaints were issued repeatedly despite no visible violation. Holiday decorations were declared excessive. Noise complaints were filed regarding sounds no neighbor had reported hearing. Officer Blackwood often visited their home personally. Midnight flashlight inspections were mentioned in whispers. Photographs of license plates were taken. Door handles were tested. The visits were framed as security checks. But the psychological intent was unmistakable. The Hendersons eventually sold their house and moved to Cedar Park. Jim Santos, owner of the local auto repair shop on Maple Street, experienced similar treatment. Backyard shed construction became a code enforcement issue. Customers were subtly discouraged from visiting his business after anonymous complaints about working vehicles parked nearby. Dorothy Brighton's grip tightened on her garden hose as she spoke. The pattern was consistent. Question authority. Question finances. Question policy. Then harassment began. The goal was not punishment. The goal was relocation. Fear was cheaper than legal eviction. Miles listened carefully, remembering criminal organizations that use similar tactics to clear territories without visible violence. The realization formed slowly but inevitably. Willowbrook Estates was functioning like a protection racket. The HOA board acted as administrative authority. Officer Blackwood functioned as enforcement muscle. Constance Blackwood operated as strategic commander. The community paid monthly fees under the assumption of maintenance and security. But financial records were starting to tell a different story. That evening, Miles launched a deeper investigation. He contacted Tyler Brooks and his wife Madison, who had quietly become allies after hearing about Miles's legal knowledge. Madison worked at First National Bank and possessed technical understanding of financial transaction structures. She brought printed documents to the Dalton kitchen table with trembling hands. Pool maintenance expenses were the first anomaly. $8,000 per month was allocated for cleaning and maintenance of community pool facilities. Miles studied the figure silently. The neighborhood pool was small by suburban standards. Regular commercial cleaning contracts rarely exceeded $2,000 monthly unless the facility was unusually complex. He researched the vendor. Maintenance Solutions LLC. The company was incorporated 3 weeks after Constance Blackwood became HOA president. The registered business address was a UPS mailbox. There were no employees listed. No equipment ownership. No verified service history. The invoices were designed to appear professional. Landscape emergency repair costs were listed at $12,000 for a quarter. Yet Willowbrook Estates showed no evidence of large-scale landscaping operations. Grass was trimmed according to HOA standards by residents themselves. Sprinkler systems functioned normally. No major infrastructure repair work was visible. The numbers suggested deliberate inflation. Miles calculated approximate financial flow. Legitimate maintenance expenses were likely being multiplied by approximately 3 times their real value. The excess funds were disappearing through shell contractor payments. Total estimated loss exceeded $70,000. The realization produced a familiar sensation in Miles's mind. He had seen this structure before. Drug cartels laundered money through fake transportation companies. Organized crime rings used construction subcontracting shells. Corruption rarely created new financial systems. It copied existing criminal models. Madison's hands shook as she pointed to check signatures. Officer Brent Blackwood's name appeared on multiple documents. The signature style was consistent. Brent was not merely intimidation enforcement. He was an active participant in the financial network. The pattern was complete. Political authority through HOA governance. Physical intimidation through law enforcement badge power. Financial extraction through vendor fraud. Selective harassment to silence investigation. Miles spent the afternoon cross-referencing financial records using techniques learned during federal operations. Evidence strength depended on pattern consistency. Multiple independent data sources confirmed the same conclusion. The community was trapped inside a controlled environment disguised as residential governance. Residents who questioned financial reports were subjected to administrative pressure. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. No single action was illegal enough to trigger immediate intervention. But combined behavior formed a prosecutable conspiracy. Miles sat silently as evening sunlight entered the kitchen window. Elena watched him carefully. She understood the expression on his face. It was the same expression he had worn during undercover operations when he discovered organized criminal structures that required dismantling from within. Determination mixed with controlled anger. Not explosive. Not emotional. Strategic. That night, as sprinklers created rhythmic water patterns across concrete sidewalks, Miles realized something else. The Blackwoods were confident. Confidence breeds operational laziness. And operational laziness creates evidence trails. The patrol car outside their house moved past 4 times in 3 hours, searchlight sweeping their property like a surveillance instrument rather than a patrol tool. Brent parked at the corner and photographed the mailbox. Miles watched through military-grade infrared cameras he had quietly installed. Let criminals document their own crimes, he remembered from federal training doctrine. Every late-night visit was being recorded in high definition. Timestamps were synchronized automatically. Multiple angle redundancy was active. The investigation was becoming self-proving. And somewhere inside Willowbrook Estates, a system built on intimidation and secrecy was beginning to fracture quietly. Miles Dalton understood something most corrupt power structures never realized. The moment fear stops controlling behavior is the moment the system starts collapsing from inside. And he was very patient. Because the next phase would not be investigation. It would be exposure. The transformation inside Willowbrook Estates did not begin with confrontation. It began with people remembering what it felt like to trust their neighbors again. Miles Dalton understood that corruption did not survive through strength alone. It survived through psychological isolation. The Blackwood system had been built on the quiet erosion of social connection. If residents feared speaking to one another, collective resistance would never form. So Miles started with something simple. Conversation. He walked the neighborhood in the late afternoon when sprinklers clicked rhythmically against concrete sidewalks and the air carried the smell of cut grass mixed with barbecue smoke drifting from backyards. Mrs. Dorothy Brighton became the symbolic starting point. She was watering her prize roses when Miles stopped to admire them again. The flowers were carefully cultivated, petals shaped by years of patient gardening rather than commercial landscaping. They spoke about childhood memories, school systems, and community life before HOA pressure changed social behavior. Dorothy's voice carried a quiet sadness when she mentioned the Hendersons. The young couple had wanted children. They spoke about it often. But after repeated enforcement visits, they stopped talking about their future. They sold their house quietly and left without organizing a farewell gathering. Fear does strange things to communities. It turns social environments into observation zones rather than living spaces. Dorothy explained that people avoided questioning the HOA during meetings because attendance records were visible. Speaking too often attracted attention. Questioning finances was treated as suspicious behavior. Patricia Mills had once asked about maintenance budgeting methodology. 2 weeks later, anonymous complaints appeared regarding her front yard decorations and mailbox alignment. The message was clear. Compliance guaranteed peace. Curiosity guaranteed trouble. Miles listened carefully, treating every story like evidence testimony even though no court was present. He had spent years interviewing criminals, victims, and informants. Emotional truth often surfaced only when people felt safe enough to speak without judgment. The Brooks family became another emotional bridge. Tyler and Madison invited Miles into their home one afternoon. Their kitchen table had become an informal intelligence center. Bank printouts were spread across the surface like investigative exhibits. Madison spoke about the pool maintenance contract again. The numbers were almost absurd in their simplicity. $8,000 monthly. 3-week-old company. UPS mailbox registration. No physical operational proof. She explained how transaction routing worked in suspicious vendor networks. Payments were transferred through intermediate accounts before reaching final recipients. This technique was common in organized financial crime. The purpose was audit confusion. Tracing money flow required following multiple transaction layers. But Madison had already begun reconstructing the path. She suspected that excess funds were being distributed between HOA leadership accounts. The evidence was not yet legally complete, but the pattern was emerging with frightening clarity. Tyler's contribution was different. He provided surveillance footage. The video showed Officer Blackwood performing midnight wellness checks. Flashlight beams moved across windows. License plates were photographed. At one point, Brent tested a front door handle as though checking structural weakness or entry resistance. The behavior was not police procedure. It was intimidation theater. Miles copied the files into his encrypted evidence system. In federal investigations, redundancy was survival. Primary storage could be compromised. Backup networks protected prosecution integrity. Elena watched him work late into the night. She had lived through his undercover years. She knew the cost of obsession. But she also knew that injustice sitting unchallenged would slowly destroy him anyway. Sophie and Jake were the invisible motivation behind everything. Miles overheard them talking one morning. Sophie asked why adults were being mean to their family. The question struck him harder than any criminal interrogation. Children should never have to analyze social hostility. The answer he gave was simple but honest. Sometimes adults forget that rules are supposed to protect people, not scare them. The children nodded as if trying to understand a complicated adult world that felt unfairly structured. Jake asked if they could swim in the pool tomorrow. The innocence of the request created emotional pressure inside Miles's chest. The community pool represented more than recreation. It symbolized inclusion. Access denial was psychological exclusion disguised as policy. That afternoon, Miles began preparing countermeasures. Surveillance cameras were upgraded to military-grade resolution. Infrared capability allowed nighttime monitoring. Multiple viewing angles ensured that no interaction could be denied later in court. Audio recording redundancy was installed because legal conviction often depended on conversational detail. Federal prosecutors preferred evidence that criminals generated themselves. He positioned himself deliberately in the front yard during evenings. Let them see preparation. Let them feel uncertainty. Psychological warfare was not about aggression. It was about forcing opponents to imagine outcomes they could not control. Constance Blackwood reacted exactly as expected. She paced inside her property perimeter like a caged animal. Her phone remained attached to her ear. Brent's patrol car increased drive-by frequency. 4 passes in 3 hours. Searchlight movements across the Dalton house became predictable. Miles treated every patrol pass as data collection. Operational patterns often reveal intent. At 11 p.m., Brent parked at the corner and approached the Dalton mailbox. He photographed house numbers. Then he tested mailbox stability by shaking it slightly, pretending inspection legitimacy. Miles watched silently through the scope of his monitoring system. The night air smelled faintly of blooming jasmine. The quiet suburban darkness carried chlorine scent drifting from the community pool. It was the same pool his children were forbidden to use. And that injustice became a psychological anchor inside him. Because this investigation was no longer only professional. It was personal. Yet Miles maintained strict emotional discipline. Federal training had taught him that anger compromises evidence quality. He continued documenting everything. Every late-night visit. Every anonymous complaint cycle. Every inspection timed deliberately during working hours. The harassment pattern was becoming statistically obvious. Selective enforcement was the signature of corrupt governance. That realization strengthened community morale indirectly. Neighbors began speaking to each other more openly. Tyler and Madison shared their experiences with other residents quietly. Dorothy Brighton started conversations during gardening hours. The social environment was shifting. Isolation was weakening. Fear requires silence to survive. The Blackwoods had built their authority on the assumption that residents would remain disconnected. But information was spreading slowly like roots growing beneath concrete. And beneath the suburban surface of Willowbrook Estates, something new was forming. Resistance was becoming community consciousness. Miles knew the next phase would be dangerous. Because corrupt systems do not surrender when exposed. They escalate. And escalation was exactly what he was waiting for. The week that followed marked the beginning of open conflict inside Willowbrook Estates. Constance Blackwood decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. The coordinated inspection campaign began on Monday morning. Elena stormed into the Dalton house carrying a stack of violation notices that looked deliberately designed to intimidate through physical presence alone. The documents were printed on thick, expensive cardstock embossed with municipal-style seals that mimicked official government authority. Grass height violation. Mailbox angle deviation. Trash can placement discrepancy. Multiple citations were scheduled with military precision. 9:15 a.m. 9:30 a.m. 9:45 a.m. The timing was not random. It was designed to strike during working hours when residents were least able to witness or challenge inspection measurements. Anonymous complaints were listed as the source of enforcement action. Miles studied the notices carefully. The grass height violation was particularly interesting. Their lawn had been measured at exactly 1/4 inch above HOA regulation standard. He asked himself a simple question. Who measures grass with surgical precision unless the measurement itself is a weapon? The answer was obvious. The inspection blitz was psychological pressure escalation. Elena collapsed into a chair, exhaustion mixing with frustration. The children watched silently, sensing emotional tension even if they could not fully understand the political conflict surrounding them. Sophie asked a question that cut deeper than any official citation. Why are adults being mean to us? Miles felt the weight of that sentence settle inside his chest. He told her the truth. Sometimes people use authority to control others instead of protecting them. Sometimes adults forget that rules are supposed to help families live safely. The explanation was simple enough for a child but carried philosophical depth for anyone listening carefully. That evening, Miles intensified surveillance documentation. Brent's patrol car increased visibility around their property. The vehicle passed 4 times within 3 hours. Each pass involved searchlights sweeping across the Dalton house. The behavior violated standard community patrol norms. It was intimidation disguised as security activity. At approximately 11 p.m., Brent exited the patrol car near the corner mailbox. He photographed house numbers again. Then he tested mailbox structural resistance by shaking it slightly. Miles recorded the interaction using multi-angle infrared cameras. The evidence was becoming legally powerful. In federal investigations, conviction probability increased dramatically when criminals documented their own misconduct unknowingly. Miles remembered countless cartel operations where suspects believed surveillance was absent. The Blackwoods were making the same mistake. Meanwhile, Tyler Brooks contacted Miles with new intelligence. Madison had discovered additional financial irregularities. Landscape emergency repair expenses of $12,000 were listed for the previous quarter. Yet Willowbrook Estates showed no visible evidence of large-scale repair operations. No major irrigation infrastructure work. No contractor equipment presence. No soil excavation. The money trail suggested inflated service billing rather than legitimate maintenance. The fraud estimate remained around $73,000 total. But Madison suspected hidden secondary transactions. If additional shell contractor layers were discovered, the total theft amount could be higher. The realization made Miles feel a quiet professional satisfaction. Corruption cases were easier to prosecute when financial architecture was amateur. The Blackwoods operation lacked sophisticated criminal laundering techniques. It was aggressive but structurally careless. That afternoon, Constance Blackwood declared total administrative war. An emergency HOA meeting was announced. The community center smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner as residents gathered under fluorescent lights that produced harsh institutional illumination. Metal folding chairs screeched across the linoleum floor as people settled nervously. Attendance had shrunk over the past year. Only 12 residents were present. Several wore Blackwood safety buttons. Constance sat at the head table like a monarch preparing to deliver judgment. Emergency session was declared open by banging a wooden gavel with theatrical authority. She spoke first. The community was facing security concerns brought to attention by local law enforcement. Miles sat quietly in the back row, notebook ready. He understood criminal organizational psychology. Corrupt entities rush power consolidation when they fear exposure. They act before public reasoning can develop. Constance proposed immediate revocation of all amenity access pending behavioral assessment. The motion was framed as safety protection. But its real purpose was control reinforcement. Board member Patricia Mills questioned the legality of emergency powers. Constance responded by citing Section 12.4 of HOA governance structure, claiming immediate action was allowed when community safety was threatened. The debate was brief. Intentionally so. Frank Torres argued that recording police interactions without consent was suspicious. Miles stood up calmly. Texas law was a one-party consent recording jurisdiction. Recording law enforcement interactions was constitutionally protected. The room fell silent. Paper shuffling noises filled the tension. The board attempted a vote. Constance announced motion passage despite only 5 board members being present. Miles stood again. Emergency votes required 7 members for quorum. The meeting was declared adjourned. Before leaving, Miles publicly cited Texas Property Code discrimination access restriction clauses. The legal statement ensured that future harassment based on background evaluation would be legally vulnerable. Several residents began looking at each other differently. Something inside the community had changed. Fear was starting to fracture. That evening, Tyler approached Miles privately. He and Madison had discovered the most important evidence yet. Bank records showed checks signed by both Blackwoods. Financial transfers were routed through Maintenance Solutions LLC. The company was clearly a shell operation. Total fraudulent activity exceeded $70,000. The signature verification evidence was particularly strong. Officer Blackwood was not only enforcing intimidation. He was actively participating in financial conspiracy. Miles photographed every document. Then he felt the weight of historical pattern recognition settle inside his professional intuition. Corrupt systems collapse when 2 conditions occur simultaneously. Financial exposure. Public witness testimony. The Blackwoods were now vulnerable on both fronts. But Miles also knew desperation can trigger dangerous behavior. Cornered narcissists often respond with unpredictable aggression. That night, surveillance cameras recorded Brent walking near the property again. His body language had changed. Confidence was replaced by tension. The investigation was approaching a critical breaking point. Miles prepared for the next phase. Because the conflict was no longer about pool access. It was about control of an entire community's future. And the final confrontation was approaching faster than anyone inside Willowbrook Estates realized. The night before the community center confrontation, Willowbrook Estates felt unusually quiet. The silence was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows impending disaster, the pause before something irreversible happens. Miles Dalton sat alone in his study, coffee growing cold beside stacks of investigative documents. The projection of financial records on his computer screen illuminated the room in pale blue light. Bank statements. Contract invoices. Check signatures. Shell company registrations. The pattern was becoming legally undeniable. $73,000 in embezzlement could already support federal conspiracy prosecution under multiple statutes, including fraud, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and organized financial misconduct. But something was bothering him. Professional instinct rarely failed him. There was always a deeper layer when corruption networks appeared too confident. He reopened the development agreement archives one more time. Page 47. The document was buried deep inside original subdivision formation paperwork, written years before the Blackwoods assumed HOA leadership. The clause was extraordinary. Emergency management transfer. In the event of financial misconduct, fraud, or breach of fiduciary duty by the HOA board, Pinnacle Properties LLC retained permanent easement authority to assume immediate governance control over common areas. Miles read the sentence 3 times. Then he felt the emotional equivalent of falling slowly into cold water. Pinnacle Properties was owned by Harrison Webb, a 61-year-old real estate developer. Webb had suffered a major financial loss approximately 6 years earlier when the subdivision's original board mishandled a construction defect lawsuit, costing him over $2 million. Motivation was obvious. Prevention of future board corruption. But the clause functioned as a corporate failsafe. If financial misconduct was proven, control could transfer instantly. Miles contacted Webb's office. The man answered personally. He had been waiting. That admission surprised Miles. Webb explained that he had monitored HOA financial activity quietly since the subdivision was established. The easement clause was his insurance policy against community leadership transforming into personal profit machines. How fast can you activate it? Miles asked. Give me bulletproof evidence, Webb replied. Corporate management can assume control in 2 weeks. The legal team had prepared activation paperwork since 2019. Corporate takeover would remove the entire Blackwood power structure. No more board presidency. No selective enforcement. No badge intimidation. No administrative harassment. Professional governance would replace authoritarian community control. Miles felt professional admiration despite the circumstances. This was a remarkably elegant containment strategy. But the most shocking revelation came from Tyler and Madison later that evening. Madison had discovered deeper financial irregularities hidden inside check routing records. Signature lines confirmed that Brent Blackwood was actively co-signing fraudulent payments. The discovery changed everything. The operation was not just HOA corruption. It was conspiracy between administrative authority and law enforcement power. Miles realized the legal severity of the case increased dramatically. Federal jurisdiction was guaranteed. Civil rights violations combined with financial conspiracy would trigger aggressive prosecution. That night, Miles experienced another professional realization. The Blackwoods were not merely criminals. They were bureaucratic predators who believed authority itself justified exploitation. And predators rarely surrender voluntarily. Wednesday morning at 2 a.m., Miles found himself surrounded by surveillance electronics spread across the bedroom floor. Elena entered quietly. The equipment resembled preparations for launching a satellite mission. She smiled despite exhaustion. "You look like you're planning alien contact," she said. "Close," Miles answered. He was connecting wireless feeds capable of recording 12 simultaneous angles. The goal was complete public documentation of the final confrontation. Redundant recording systems were essential. Criminals sometimes attempted to destroy single-camera evidence. Multiple synchronized feeds eliminated that possibility. Sunday evening became psychological preparation stage. Miles deliberately worked outside in his front yard where he could be seen installing equipment. He wanted the Blackwoods to understand that something was coming. Fear without clarity often produces mistakes. Constance paced inside her property perimeter like a trapped animal. Her phone remained permanently attached to her ear. Brent's patrol vehicle made irregular route movements. Patrol behavior had shifted from dominance display to uncertainty monitoring. Miles observed the change carefully. It meant the Blackwoods were sensing threat but did not yet understand the source. That was ideal operational position. Late that night, Tyler and Madison rehearsed witness testimony. Miles coached them using interrogation psychology techniques learned during cartel investigations. Numbers convict. Emotional testimony motivates public response. They practiced describing fear experienced inside their own home. Midnight flashlight visits. Intimidation pressure. Social exclusion tactics. Madison summarized the financial fraud in simple language. Pool maintenance costs should not equal Versailles fountain cleaning expenses. The line made Elena smile quietly. The community was beginning to understand the corruption structure in human terms rather than legal terminology. Monday night was approaching. Webb's corporate team was preparing broadcast quality presentation equipment. Professional lighting. Wireless microphones. Projection screens capable of displaying financial transactions in courtroom detail. Channel 7 reporter Amanda Cross had agreed to broadcast live coverage. Public accountability was becoming unavoidable. The Blackwoods were still unaware of the scale of opposition forming against them. But desperation was beginning to show. Brent's patrol presence became more aggressive. Searchlight sweeps across the Dalton property increased. Yet Miles remained calm. Because he understood the final principle of organized crime dismantling. When a corrupt system realizes it is losing, it often destroys itself through impulsive retaliation. And he was waiting for that moment. Because the hunters were about to become hunted. Legally, publicly, and permanently. The community center was filled well before the meeting officially began. Residents entered quietly, carrying years of suppressed fear that had lived inside Willowbrook Estates like an invisible weight. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold institutional glow across rows of metal folding chairs arranged facing the front stage. The room felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood gathering. Broadcast quality cameras were already positioned carefully. Professional lighting softened the harsh overhead brightness, and projection screens waited silently at the front wall, ready to display evidence that would decide the future of the community. Willowbrook Estates was no longer the neighborhood it had been 2 years earlier. Fear had slowly weakened. People spoke in low voices, exchanging glances filled with memories of anonymous complaints, midnight harassment visits, and selective enforcement targeting families who questioned authority. The Blackwoods arrived at 6:45 p.m. Constance walked with the posture of someone performing authority rather than truly possessing it. Her designer blazer was perfectly fitted, though tension showed in the stiffness of her shoulders. Brent followed behind, sweating despite the aggressively maintained air conditioning. His hand rested near his weapon out of habit rather than tactical necessity. They still believed intimidation could preserve control. They were wrong. Constance struck the wooden gavel loudly and announced that routine community business would begin. The word routine felt disconnected from the tension inside the hall. Harrison Webb stood first. He explained the emergency management easement clause contained in the original subdivision development agreement. The clause allowed Pinnacle Properties LLC to assume governance authority if financial misconduct or fiduciary breach by HOA leadership was proven. Legal documents thicker than a criminal indictment file were placed on the table. Section 4.7 of the subdivision agreement clearly described emergency transfer authority. The community had unknowingly been living inside a corruption containment structure designed years earlier by the developer. Constance attempted to dismiss the presentation as an outside attack, but confidence was already leaving her voice. David Kim activated the projection system. High-definition bank statements appeared across the wall. Payments made to Maintenance Solutions LLC were displayed. The company had been created 3 weeks after Constance became HOA president. Its registered business address was a UPS mailbox. There were no verified employees, no equipment inventory, and no documented operational activity. The pool maintenance contract alone cost $8,000 monthly. Landscape emergency repair expenses of $12,000 per quarter were shown alongside neighborhood photographs revealing no major infrastructure damage or large contractor presence. The financial pattern was obvious. Inflated billing routed through shell vendor structures. Gasps spread through the audience as residents realized they had been paying for services that were never truly provided. Constance suddenly screamed that the presentation was a coordinated attack against legitimate community leadership. Amanda Cross, the journalist covering the event, continued recording every moment. Brent stepped forward aggressively, demanding that residents disperse because they were interfering with official HOA governance. The declaration sounded more desperate than authoritative. Years of intimidation conditioning inside the community still triggered anxiety reactions among some residents. But Tyler Brooks stood up holding his evidence folder. Officer Blackwood's signature appeared on multiple fraudulent checks. The testimony confirmed Brent's participation in the conspiracy network. Brent attempted to claim he was maintaining security order, but the reporter immediately stated that there was no active investigation registered in the police department database. The intimidation strategy collapsed under administrative verification. Constance lost emotional control completely. She accused the residents of conspiracy against respected community leadership. She claimed outside influences were attacking property protection standards. The language revealed the mindset of authoritarian justification. Miles Dalton stood slowly. The room became silent. He introduced himself as a retired FBI Financial Crimes Unit investigator and explained that the past month had been a federal-level documentation operation covering harassment incidents, civil rights violations, and financial conspiracy activity inside the neighborhood. Every midnight visit. Every anonymous complaint. Every fraudulent financial transaction. Wire fraud and deprivation of civil rights under color of law were the primary charges. The minimum federal sentencing exposure exceeded 15 years. Brent staggered backward as realization struck him. 20 years of police authority collapsed psychologically in that moment. Constance screamed that the investigation was persecution and demanded to know who started it. Miles answered calmly that he began the investigation when his family was targeted. Federal agents entered silently. Agent Lisa Rodriguez announced that Brent was under arrest for deprivation of rights under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the hall. Constance collapsed into her chair as authority disappeared from her posture. She attempted one final defense, claiming residents were victims of conspiracy. Forensic accountant David Kim projected signature verification evidence showing Constance's name on 47 fraudulent financial transactions. The proof was legally devastating. Dorothy Brighton spoke about 2 years of fear living inside the neighborhood. She described selective enforcement, midnight intimidation visits, and social pressure targeting families who questioned finances. She called the system domestic harassment. Several residents used the word terrorism to describe their experience. Webb announced that Pinnacle Properties would immediately assume emergency management authority. Professional accounting, equal policy enforcement, and transparent governance would replace the old system. Applause began slowly. First from Dorothy. Then Tyler. then Jim Santos. Finally, the entire community erupted in celebration. As the Blackwoods were escorted outside, Constance screamed that property values would collapse and crime would rise. Miles replied quietly that constitutional rights were not threats to safety but foundations of justice. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates was transformed. HOA fees dropped by 30% after eliminating embezzlement losses. Financial reports were posted publicly every month. Board meetings followed democratic procedures. Constance pled guilty to 18 federal charges and received 8 years in prison. Brent received 12 years for conspiracy and civil rights violations. Recovered funds were returned to the community along with federal damages. Webb created the Blackwood Corruption Memorial Scholarship Fund, donating $25,000 annually for students studying criminal justice and civil rights protection. Dorothy Brighton became HOA president and started monthly community coffee meetings where residents could speak freely. Security cameras were installed in common areas to prevent future abuse of authority. The transformation spread beyond Willowbrook Estates as other neighborhoods requested similar oversight structures after discovering corruption risks. Tyler and Madison became consultants helping detect financial crime patterns. Elena began neighborhood CPR and first aid training programs. The community pool reopened fully. Children swam freely without intimidation. Miles Dalton retired completely from investigative work, though he occasionally helped communities recognize corruption structures. Every evening, he watched his children laugh while swimming in the pool their families paid to access. The neighborhood had become a place where people spoke openly again. No harassment. No intimidation. No fear. As sunset colored the sky above Willowbrook Estates, Miles understood the greatest victory was not the arrests or financial recovery. It was the return of normal life. Because justice is not only about punishment. Sometimes justice is simply allowing people to live quietly, safely, and without fear.